New signs that we may be reaching a tipping point in America's longest war. This morning, the president talking Afghanistan and Pakistan with his national security team as part of their now monthly meeting on the war effort. Of course, in that meeting, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who may have had a rare moment of candor about the war during a recent speech at West Point. Give a listen.
In my opinion, any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined, as General MacArthur so delicately put it.
And in keeping with the new theme of honesty on just what a mess this war really is, after years of fighting for a valley in eastern Afghanistan, once called vital to the war effort, U.S. troops are now pulling back from the deadly Peck Valley. One military official telling the New York Times, quote, "What we figured out is that people in the Peck really aren't anti-U.S. or anti-anything. They just want to be left alone. Our presence is what's destabilizing this area." So could the military finally be recognizing how futile our efforts in Afghanistan really are? And even then, how do we get out? Joining us now from Washington is Lieutenant Colonel Antony Shaffer. He's currently with the Center for Advanced Defense Studies and the author of Operation Darkheart, the book censored by the Pentagon. Also with us, David Cortwright, author of the new book, Ending Obama's War. David, let me start with you. I know you've struggled with the question of what exactly we should be doing in Afghanistan. You've got sympathy for the plight of women and for the plight of what's been a very difficult situation for the Afghani people for centuries. Tell us where you've come out and what you think the course of action is we need to take now.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, after 9/11, of course, many of us thought this was the right cause, a just war. But it's dragged on. It's become a major counterinsurgency war against a Taliban enemy that we look like we cannot defeat. General Petraeus calls it an industrial strength insurgency. There is no military solution, so we need to find a better way. I think the president's right that we need to start the troop withdrawals in July, but that needs to be combined, in my view, with a whole series of other measures. We need to try to figure out a ceasefire arrangement with the insurgents. I think we need to talk directly with the insurgents to try to arrange a political accommodation in Kabul. And we need a security agreement. We had the security agreement with Iraq. It seems to be working pretty well. It's a phased withdrawal, building up the other side as we get out. Maybe some kind of a similar security agreement could be reached with the Kabul government and with the Taliban so that we have a mutual ceasefire, we gradually pull out. And another element that we've talked about is why not bring in an interim kind of peacekeeping force, a security protection force. The Taliban actually proposed a couple of years ago that they would support a, quote, Muslim-led protection force, peacekeeping force. Of course, that doesn't really exist, but if we worked with other Muslim countries, we could possibly bring in a security peacekeeping force to facilitate our gradual disengagement and to provide security while we are in this interim period and as political negotiations unfold for a new kind of political arrangement in Kabul.
Tony, a lot of that sounds reasonable from David, but I also hear echoes of peace with honor, and I'm wondering, are we going to be there then? Does this mean somehow we're still there 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now with some presence? And what, if anything, would be different on the ground from the mess that we seem to face now?
Well, nothing, and that's the problem. We've turned this into a conventional mess because we've put conventional forces in there to do a conventional job. We need to step back. I would start the withdrawal tomorrow. There's a British minister named Ottaway who proposed to the objectives have been met, and he's a conservative minister in England, said let's think about getting out sooner. This is what we need to do. The problem is we become the sentinel of corruption. They have a patronage system which allows for you could buy your way into being a governor of a province if you pay enough money to President Karzai. That's the problem. Even if we step away now, the government will remain the biggest problem. The people of Afghanistan, as we saw in the Pesh Valley, they're not ungoverned, they're self-governed. They want to be left alone. The longer we're there, the more forces we have there, the more we will destabilize. What we need to do, General Petraeus has said this, we need to focus on a Northern Ireland-style peace process. The British have talked about this. And the longer we keep the Taliban out, the longer they will attack the process. We've got to embrace them and bring them to the table.
David, Barbara Tuchman, I'm sure you know, wrote a great book called The March of Folly. I wanted to just put up a quote from that to read to folks, because it's what Barbara Tuchman wrote in that book was a phenomenon noticeable throughout history, regardless of place or period, is the pursuit by government of policies contrary to their own interests. Are we in a situation like that at this point, David?
Oh, absolutely. It's been long past the time when there's any benefit we could get from pursuing this military operation in Afghanistan. I agree with the Colonel. We ought to start the withdrawal as soon as we can, and we need to talk to the Taliban. Maybe there'd be a better government than what we have at Karzai if we bring them to the table. This current government is unworthy of the sacrifice of our men and women in uniform. So we should find some new political arrangement. Ultimately, these things always have a political solution. We've talked with our enemies before. We did that back in Vietnam. The IRA, of course, is a good example where we now have brought them into government. And the Taliban has an interest. They want to get rid of the foreign forces. So let's use that. That's our leverage. We can say, well, we're ready to go. We'll put together a timetable, but we want you to work with the Kabul government, and we'd like your cooperation in making sure that al-Qaeda does not reestablish bases. Well, why don't we try it? There's no guarantee it'll work, but a negotiation, direct talks with the Taliban is absolutely necessary.
Tony, you've been in these trouble spots, serving in the military with distinction. You know, when you see things like we had an incident with a bunch of kids killed by accidental fire that General Petraeus had to apologize for just this week, what's the morale like on the ground for our troops who are trying to carry out a mission they've been given, and yet we're stuck in what it's just hard to see is anything other than a quagmire?
It's tough, and frankly, the Taliban encourage this sort of thing. In my book, in my first mission outside the wire, if you read Operation Dark Heart, I have a shoot-don't shoot situation where I almost shoot an 8-year-old in the streets of Kabul because he's running with what looks like a hand grenade in his hand. So you've always got these sort of things that creep up, and it's tough. It's tough on the people who have to endure it. It's tough on our troops. And this is going to continue to wear on. This is why we need to disengage, pull out of those areas, let this process start to work. We should not be the ones trying to institute a force of government on these people right now.
And yet, Tony, just to stick with that, what do you really expect? Are we going to still have 50,000 troops, 20,000 troops 3, 4, 5 years from now?
Well, I think we have to be engaged somewhat in the region. We don't have to be there en masse. If they're tribal, we need to have a small element of special operations guys who are the biggest and baddest tribe who go in to make sure that al-Qaeda cannot reestablish a foothold. That needs to be our objective. We have achieved that objective to date. We have achieved the fact that there's been no new attacks from Afghanistan, and the Taliban are there now. They're Pashtun. They're from there. The al-Qaeda guys are gone. They're in Pakistan. We need to start focusing more on Pakistan than on Afghanistan if we're going to be effective.
David, I want to give you the last word on this. I know you and organizations you've helped lead have been involved with really being the base of support that catapulted Barack Obama into office, partly on his anti-war credentials because of Iraq. Is that base prepared to really revolt against Obama if you don't see the kind of substantial withdrawals coming when the supposed deadline in July is meant to be?
Yeah, there's going to be pressure. And in fact, the Democratic National Committee met the other day and they adopted a resolution urging the president to have a, quote, substantial troop withdrawal beginning this summer. So if there's not real progress towards solving this war, towards getting our troops out and working out some kind of an agreement where we have at least some sort of honorable exit, where the sacrifice of our troops is not in vain, where we can help with a new political arrangement. We haven't mentioned the fact that we need to continue to provide economic assistance and social development assistance for the people of Afghanistan, especially the women, to help improve health care, especially the care for the rights of women and the like. We can do those sorts of things without having to be involved in a large counterinsurgency war. So the president's under a pressure here now, and he needs to deliver a serious realignment of the strategy, start the exit process, and develop a political strategy.
David Cortwright, Antony Shaffer, a grim situation that keeps lingering on in ways I find hard to see any happy outcome, even if we find our way to, quote-unquote, peace with honor somehow. Thanks very much for sharing your insights and thoughts.